Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix Chapter 9 The Woes of Mrs. Weasley. Harry found himself missing Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry more and more as the end of the holidays approached. He could hardly wait to see Hagrid again, play Quidditch, or even wander around in Professor Sprout's greenhouse. Professor Sprout teaches herbology at Hogwarts, among the small vegetable patches. Getting out of this dirty, moldy house felt like a blessing. Half the cupboards here were still locked, and every time you passed by, Creature would jump out from the shadows, panting and cursing. However, Harry was careful not to voice any of his thoughts, lest they reached Sirius's ears. In fact, living at the headquarters of the anti-Voldemort movement wasn't as fun or exciting as Harry had imagined before he came, even though plenty of Order of the Phoenix members came and went regularly. Sometimes they stayed for meals, other times, they just had brief whispered conversations for a few minutes. Mrs. Weasley made sure Harry and the others were kept out of it, whether by magical means like extendable ears, or just normally, and it seemed like even Sirius thought Harry should not know more than he did on the night he arrived. On the last day of the holidays, Harry was thoroughly cleaning out his wardrobe. Hedwig had left owl droppings there, when Ron came into the bedroom with 2 letters. "The book lists have arrived," Ron said, tossing a letter to Harry, who was standing on a chair. "About time, I thought they'd forgotten. Usually, they arrive much earlier than this." Harry scooped up the last bit of droppings into a trash bag, and tossed it into a wastebasket in the corner over Ron's head. The wastebasket swallowed the bag, and let out a loud belch. Harry then opened his letter, which contained 2 pieces of parchment. One was the usual notice stating the new term would begin on September 1st, and the other was a list of the books he would need for the upcoming school year. Only 2 new books, Harry read from the list. Asterisk, The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 5 Asterisk, by Miranda Gosshawk, and Asterisk, Defensive Magical Theory Asterisk, by Wilbert Slinkard. With a loud pop, Fred and George appeared at Harry's right side. Harry was so used to their sudden appearances that he didn't even fall off his chair. "We were just wondering who set the requirement for Slinkard's book," Fred said, "because it means Dumbledore has found another defense against the dark arts teacher." "And about time, too," said George. "What do you mean?" Harry asked as he jumped down beside them. "Well, a few weeks ago, we eavesdropped on a conversation between Mum and Dad with our extendable ears," Fred told Harry. "From what they were saying, Dumbledore had a real problem finding someone to take the job this year." "Not surprising, really," said George. "Just look at what happened to the last 4 teachers. One was sacked, one died, one lost his memory, and one spent 9 months in a box." Harry counted on his fingers. "Yeah, I see what you mean. What do you think, Ron?" Fred asked. Ron didn't answer. Harry looked around. Ron was standing still, mouth slightly open, staring at the letter from Hogwarts. "What's wrong?" Fred called impatiently. He walked over and looked over Ron's shoulder at the parchment. Fred's jaw dropped. "Prefect," he said in disbelief, staring at the letter. "Prefect." George leapt forward and grabbed the envelope from Ron's other hand. He turned it over, and Harry saw something red and gold drop into George's palm. "Unbelievable," George muttered. "They must have made a mistake." Fred snatched the envelope back and held it up to the light as if checking for a watermark. No one in their right mind would make Ron a prefect. The twins shook their heads in unison, staring at Harry. "We thought it would be you." Fred's tone suggested that Harry had somehow tricked them. "We thought Dumbledore would pick you," George said angrily. "You won the House Cup and everything else," Fred added. "I considered all sorts of crazy ideas, but never that one," George told Fred. "Yeah," said Fred slowly. "Yeah, you've been in too much trouble, mate. Well, at least one of you got the priority." He strode over to Harry and patted him on the back, giving Ron a stern look. "Little Ron, a prefect. Oh, Mum's going to go crazy, George groaned, tossing the prefect badge back to Ron as if it might dirty his hands. Ron remained silent. He picked up the badge, stared at it for a moment, and then threw it to Harry, seemingly asking Harry to confirm its authenticity. Harry caught the badge, a big P, shining on the Gryffindor lion emblem. Harry had seen a similar badge on Percy's chest when he first entered Hogwarts. The door flew open, and Hermione rushed into the room, crying. Her cheeks were red, her hair disheveled, and she was clutching a letter in her hand. You got. She looked at the badge in Harry's hand and screamed, I knew it. She waved her letter excitedly. Me too, Harry, me too. No, Harry quickly said, shoving the badge back into Ron's hand. Ron got the badge, not me. What? Hermione's face turned red as Ron stared at her challengingly. My name is on the letter, he said. Hermione looked completely baffled. Oh. Well done, Ron. That's really unexpected, George nodded. No, Hermione's face went even redder. No, it's not like that. Ron has done a lot, he really. The door behind Hermione opened wider, and Mrs. Weasley entered the room with a pile of freshly cleaned robes. Ginny said the book lists have just arrived, she said, looking at all the envelopes. Then she walked to the bedside and began to sort the robes into 2 piles. You give me the book list, and I can give it to Mr. Diggle this afternoon, so you can have the books by the time you set off. Ron, I'll have to get you some bigger pajamas. These are at least 6 inches too short. I can't believe how fast you're growing. What color do you like? Get him something red and yellow to match his badge, George said with a grin. Match his what? Mrs. Weasley asked absent-mindedly, as she folded a pair of socks and placed them on Ron's pile. His badge, Fred said quickly, expecting the worst. His shiny new badge. It took a moment for Fred's words to reach Mrs. Weasley's ears, busy as she was with folding Ron's pajamas. Then suddenly, wait a minute, Ron, you didn't. Ron held up his badge, and Mrs. Weasley let out a shriek like Hermione's. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Oh, Ron, this is wonderful. A prefect. Every single one of our family. So what are Fred and I, next-door neighbors? George asked indignantly, but Mrs. Weasley pushed him aside and hugged her youngest son tightly. Wait until your father hears. Ron, I'm so proud of you. What an exciting piece of news. You're going to graduate as a top student, just like Bill and Percy did. This is the first step. Oh, what a wonderful thing to happen in the midst of all this trouble. I'm shaking all over. Oh, Ron, Fred and George were making gagging noises behind Mrs. Weasley's back, but she didn't notice. Her arms were still around Ron's neck, and she was kissing him all over his face, which was now redder than his badge. Mum, get off me, Mum, you're strangling me. Ron said, trying to push her away. Mrs. Weasley released him and, gasping for breath, said, well, then, what would you like? We gave Percy an owl, of course, but you already have one. What do you mean? Ron looked like he couldn't believe his ears. You're going to get a reward. Mrs. Weasley said happily. How about a set of new robes? We already bought him some, Fred said mischievously, looking as though he regretted his generosity at the time. Or a new cauldron. Charlie's old one is all rusted. Or a new pet rat. You always liked Scabbers. Ron's pet was a fat, sleepy grey rat named Scabbers, who was actually an animagus and one of Harry Potter's father's friends. He had betrayed them, sided with Voldemort, and then hid as a rat in Ron's family. In the previous book, Scabbers left Ron and helped with Voldemort's resurrection. Mom, Ron said hopefully, could I get a new broom? Mrs. Weasley's face fell a little. Brooms were expensive. Not a really advanced one. Ron added hastily. Just Just one that's a bit newer than my old one, Mrs. Weasley hesitated for a moment and then smiled. Of course, you can. All right, if I'm going to buy a new broom, I'd better go now. See you later, little Ronikins, one of my prefects. And don't forget to pack your trunk. A prefect, oh, I'm shaking all over. She kissed Ron on the cheek again, took a deep breath, and hurried out of the room. Fred and George exchanged a glance. You won't mind if we don't kiss you, will you, Ron? George said in a mock-serious voice. If you like, we could bow to you instead, said Fred. Oh, shut up, Ron snapped, glaring at them. Or what, said Fred, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Lock us in detention. I'd love to see him try, said George, laughing. If you're not careful, he really will. Hermione said crossly. Fred and George burst into laughter, and Ron muttered, Shut up, Hermione, George, we really should be careful now, Fred said, pretending to be frightened. We've got a couple of watchful eyes on us, yeah, it looks like our troublemaking days are over, said George, shaking his head. With a loud bang, the twin brothers disappeared, those two. Hermione glared at the ceiling in frustration. They could now hear Fred and George laughing loudly in their room upstairs. Just ignore them, Ron. They're just jealous. I don't think so, said Ron, looking up at the ceiling thoughtfully. They've always said only idiots become prefects, and I think they still believe that. But he quickly added in a happier tone, they've never had a new broom, though. I hope I can go with Mum to pick it out. She probably can't afford a Nimbus series, but a new clean sweep would be great. Yeah, I think I'll go tell her I like the clean sweep series, so she knows. And with that, Ron dashed out of the room, leaving Harry and Hermione alone. For some reason, Harry found that he didn't really want to look at Hermione right now. He turned toward the bed, picked up the pile of freshly cleaned robes Mrs. Weasley had left, and walked toward his trunk. Harry. Hermione asked tentatively. Well done, Hermione, Harry said, his voice sounding strangely enthusiastic, not at all like his usual self. He still wasn't looking at Hermione. That's great, being a prefect is fantastic, thanks, Hermione said. Harry, can I borrow Hedwig for a bit? So I can tell my parents the good news. They'll be really pleased. I think they understand what a prefect is. Yeah, sure, Harry said, still using that unsettlingly cheery voice. Take her. He moved closer to his trunk, placing the robes at the bottom as Hermione went to call Hedwig down from the wardrobe. He pretended to be checking his things. After a while, Harry heard the door close, but he stayed bent over, listening. The only sound he could hear was the empty frame on the wall chuckling softly again, and the wastepaper basket in the corner was now coughing up owl droppings. He straightened up and looked back. Hermione was gone, and so was Hedwig. Harry hurriedly crossed the room and closed the door, then slowly returned to his bed and lay down, staring blankly at the bottom of the wardrobe. He had completely forgotten that fifth-year students could be selected as prefects. He had been so worried about possibly being expelled that he hadn't considered that the badge might be sent to a particular person. But if he had remembered, if he had thought about it, what could he have expected? This isn't about you, a small, honest voice in his mind said. Harry buried his face in his hands. He couldn't deceive himself. If he had known Ron's prefect badge was on its way, he would have hoped it was for him, not Ron. Does this make him as arrogant as Malfoy? Does he think he's better than others? Does he really believe he is better than Ron? No, the small voice said defiantly. Is that true? Harry felt doubtful as he uneasily examined his own feelings. I'm only better than him in Quidditch. I'm not better than him at anything else. That was clearly true, Harry thought. His schoolwork wasn't any better than Ron's. But what about outside of school? What about the adventures he, Ron, and Hermione had since arriving at Hogwarts. Those dangerous actions were much worse than being expelled. "Well, Ron and Hermione were with me most of the time," the voice said in Harry's head. "But not all the time," Harry argued with himself. "They weren't with me on the Quidditch pitch. They didn't uncover the basilisk. The basilisk, one of the most terrifying magical creatures, has deadly fangs and a lethal gaze that kills anyone who meets its eyes. The only way to subdue it is with the crowing of a rooster, which is fatal to it. It appeared in the second book, *The Chamber of Secrets*. They weren't there on the night Sirius escaped, and they didn't fend off those Dementors. They weren't there with me at the graveyard when Voldemort was resurrected." Now, that same inappropriate feeling from his first night here was taking over again. Harry thought angrily, "I have certainly done more than any of them. But maybe," the small voice said fairly, "maybe Dumbledore didn't choose you as prefect because you're in a dangerous situation. Maybe he had other reasons for choosing them, Ron. Maybe there's something you don't know." Harry opened his eyes and looked at the foot of the wardrobe through his fingers. He was remembering something Fred had said: no sane person would make Ron a prefect. Harry let out a scornful sound, but immediately felt disgusted with himself. Ron hadn't asked Dumbledore to give him the prefect badge. It wasn't Ron's fault, it was his, Harry's, Ron's best friend in the world, who was angry at Ron for not getting the prefect badge, and mocking Ron behind his back with the twins. Was this the first time he had hit Harry somewhere? Just then, Harry heard Ron's footsteps on the stairs again. He got up, straightened his glasses, and quickly forced a smile onto his face as Ron came in through the door. "Just in time for Mom," Ron said happily. "She said she might get me a clean sweep broom if possible." "Cool," Harry said, relieved to hear his voice no longer sounded forced. "Listen, Ron, well done, mate." The smile faded from Ron's face. "I never thought it would be me," he said, shaking his head. "I thought it would be you." "Ah, I caused too much trouble," Harry echoed Fred. "Yeah," Ron said, "I guess. Well, we'd better pack, hadn't we?" Strangely, their belongings and themselves had become more and more scattered since they arrived here. It took most of the afternoon to retrieve all their books and items from around the room and pack them into their school trunks. Harry noticed that Ron kept moving his prefect badge around. First, it was on his bedside table, then he took it out and placed it on his folded robes, as if admiring how the red looked against the black, until Fred and George burst in and suggested Ron wear the badge on his forehead and put a permanent sticking charm on it. Then Ron gently wrapped the badge in his maroon socks and locked his trunk. Around 6 o'clock, Mrs. Weasley returned from Diagon Alley. She had bought a lot of books and a long package wrapped in thick parchment paper. Ron cheered and took the package from her hands. "Don't open it now, it's time for dinner." "I hope you all come downstairs," Mrs. Weasley said, but as soon as she was out of Ron's sight, he immediately tore open the package and enthusiastically inspected every inch of his new broom, utterly entranced. The table in the basement was filled with food. Mrs. Weasley had hung a red banner above the table that read, "Congratulations Ron and Hermione on becoming prefects." Harry thought he hadn't seen Mrs. Weasley this happy all holiday. When Harry, Ron, Hermione, Fred, George, and Ginny entered the room, she said, "I thought we shouldn't just have dinner, we should have a little celebration," she continued cheerfully. "Your father and Bill are on their way, Ron. I sent them an owl, they're all excited." Fred rolled his eyes. Sirius, Lupin, Tonks, and Kingsley Shacklebolt had all arrived. When Harry finished a piece of clotted cream fudge, Mad-Eye Moody also limped in. "Alastair, I'm so glad you could come," Mrs. Weasley said happily as Moody took off his traveling cloak. "We've been wanting to ask you for a long time. Can you take a look at the desk in the sitting room? We don't want to open it in case there's something really nasty inside." "Sure, Molly," Moody said, rotating his magical eye to look through the ceiling of the kitchen to the upstairs. The sitting room, he muttered as his pupils gradually shrank. The desk in the corner. Well, I see it's a boggart. Do you want me to go up and get rid of it now, Molly? No, no need. I'll do it later myself, Mrs. Weasley said. Come have a drink. Actually, we're having a little celebration, she pointed to the red banner. 4 prefects in the family, she said happily, ruffling Ron's hair. Prefects, huh? Moody muttered. His normal eye was looking at Ron, while his magical eye spun around to the back of his head, staring behind him. When Moody turned his gaze towards Harry, Harry felt uncomfortable, so he walked away, and went over to stand beside Sirius and Lupin. Well, congratulations, Moody said, still watching Ron with his normal eye. But remember, authority figures always attract trouble. But I guess Dumbledore believes you can handle most of it, otherwise, he wouldn't have chosen you. Ron was quite taken aback by Moody's view on things, but the arrival of his father and eldest brother saved him from having to respond. Mrs. Weasley was in such a good mood that she didn't even complain about them bringing Mundungus along. Mundungus was wearing a long coat that seemed to have an odd bulge in an unlikely place, and he refused to take it off. He put his coat alongside Moody's cloak. Come on, let's have a toast, Mr. Weasley said, raising his glass after everyone had gotten a drink. To Ron and Hermione, the new Gryffindor prefects. As everyone toasted and cheered them, Ron and Hermione bowed and thanked them. I never made prefect either, Tonks said brightly behind Harry as everyone went to get some food. Today, her hair was a tomato red and hung down to her waist, making her look like she could be Ginny's older sister. Because the headmaster thought I lacked certain necessary qualities. Like what? Ginny asked, picking a roast potato. Like the ability to behave appropriately, Tonks replied. Ginny laughed, and Hermione, unsure if she should laugh, ended up choking on a large piece of honeycomb. And what about you, Sirius? Ginny asked, patting Hermione's back. Sirius, standing on Harry's right, burst into laughter as usual. No one would have made me a prefect. I spent too much time in detention with James. Remus was the good one. He was made prefect. I think Dumbledore might have hoped I would learn some self-control by being around my best friend, Lupin said. But I have to say, I failed miserably. Harry's spirits lifted instantly. His father had not been a prefect either. For a moment, the party seemed fun. He picked up a plate, feeling that everyone in the room had become twice as likable. Ron was eagerly showing off his new broomstick to anyone who would listen. 70 miles in 10 seconds, how about that? The Comet 290 only does 60 miles, and it has a very generous tail wing. Based on the handle of what? Hermione was enthusiastically discussing her views on house elf rights with Lupin. I think it's as unreasonable as the segregation against werewolves, isn't it? It all stems from the horrible belief that wizards are superior to other beings. Mrs. Weasley was still engaging in her usual debate about Bill's hair. Really, it's way too long. You're very handsome, you'd look even more so with shorter hair, wouldn't he, Harry? Oh, I don't know. Harry was slightly flustered when asked his opinion, so he walked over to Fred, George, and Mundungus, who were gathered in the corner. When Mundungus saw Harry coming, he fell silent, but Fred winked at Harry and called him over. It's all right, Fred told Mundungus. We can trust Harry, he's our benefactor. Look what old Dung brought us. George said, showing Harry his open palm, which was full of what looked like shriveled black pods, though they emitted a faint cracking sound even while completely still. These are venomous tentacular seeds, George explained. We're using them to make skiving snack boxes. They are C-class non-tradable materials, so getting them was a bit tricky. How about 10 galleons, old Dung? Fred suggested. Think of the trouble I'm in, huh? Mundungus said, his bloodshot, loose eyes narrowing even more. Sorry, kids, but if it's less than 20 galleons, I'd make nothing at all. Dung likes to make jokes like this, Fred told Harry. Yeah, so far his best was selling a bag of fake feathers for 6 sickles. Watch out, Harry warned them in a low voice. What? Fred asked. Nothing. Just that Mum's busy whispering with Prefect Ron, Harry said. But Moody can see what you're doing with his magic eye, Harry reminded them. Mundungus nervously glanced behind him. Good tip, he muttered. All right, kids, 10 galleons it is, take them quick. Well done, Harry. Fred said joyfully when Mundungus emptied all the seeds from his pocket into the twins' hands and hurried over to the dining table. We'd better take these upstairs. Harry watched them leave, feeling a bit uneasy. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley had always wanted to know how Fred and George were funding their joke shop. Eventually, they would find out it was related to him. Giving the Triwizard Tournament winnings to the twins seemed like a straightforward decision at the time, but if it led to another family rift and the twins ending up estranged like Percy, what would that mean? If Mrs. Weasley found out he had helped Fred and George pursue a career she disapproved of, would she still treat him like a son? The twins went upstairs, and Harry stood there, feeling guilty. Suddenly, Harry heard his name being mentioned by someone. Despite all the chatter around him, he could still make out Kingsley's deep voice. Why didn't Dumbledore choose Harry as a prefect? Kingsley asked. He has his reasons, Lupin replied. But doing so would show our trust in Harry. If it were me, I would insist on doing it this way, Kingsley persisted, especially with the Daily Prophet mocking Harry's situation every few days. Harry didn't turn around. He didn't want Lupin or Kingsley to know he was listening to their conversation. Even though he wasn't hungry, he returned to the dining table with Mundungus. The enthusiasm for the celebration evaporated as quickly as it had come. He wished he could just go upstairs to sleep. Moody was sniffing intensely at a chicken leg, but clearly, he didn't find any traces of poison, because he started eating it. The handle is made of Spanish oak, coated with protective varnish, and has shock absorbers. Ron was introducing Tonks to Mrs. Weasley, who let out a big yawn. I think I should get rid of that boggart before I go to bed. Arthur, I don't want the party to go on too late, okay? Good night, dear Harry. She left the kitchen. Harry put down his plate, hesitating. If he followed Mrs. Weasley upstairs, would the others notice? Are you all right, Harry? Moody asked vaguely. I'm fine, Harry lied. Moody took a big swig from his flask, staring at Harry with his magical eye. Come here, Harry. I think you'll be interested in something, Moody said, taking out a worn-out magical photo album from the pocket of his robe. These are the members of the original Order of the Phoenixe, Moody grumbled. I found this last night, while looking for my invisibility cloak. It looks like Voldemort didn't return the good album. I thought people might be interested in seeing it. Harry took the album. Inside was a small group of people, some waving at him, others raising glasses and looking back at him. That's me, Moody said nonchalantly, pointing to himself in the album. He was easy to recognize, though his hair was grayer, and his nose was still intact. Next to me is Dumbledore, and on the other side is Daedalus Diggle. That's Marlene McKinnon. She and her entire family were killed 2 weeks after this photo was taken. That's Frank and Alice Longbottom. Harry felt a pang in his stomach when he saw Alice Longbottom's face. Although he had never met her, he was very familiar with her friendly face. It was just like her son Neville's. Despicable scum, Moody growled, maybe it was better they died. That's Emmeline Vance, you've seen her. This is Lupin, obviously. Benji Fenwick, they got him too. We only found a small part of his body, just this bit. As he spoke, he prodded the picture, and the people in it slowly moved. Those who were blurry in the background moved to the front. That's Edgar Bones. Emmeline Bones's brother. He was a great wizard. They killed him and his whole family. Sturgis Podmore, wow, he looks so young. Caradoc Dearborn, he disappeared 6 months after this photo was taken. We never even found his body. Hagrid, of course, he looks the same as ever. Alpheus Doge, you've seen him too. I'd forgotten he used to wear that ridiculous hat. Gideon Pruitt and his brother Fabian were heroes. They fought against 5 Death Eaters and died. Move, move. The people in the album jostled each other, and those originally in the back right corner moved to the front. That's Dumbledore's brother, Aberforth. I only met him once, a strange fellow. That's Dorcas Meadows, Voldemort killed her himself. Sirius, still with short hair, and... Come on, I think you'll like this. Harry's heart sank. His father and mother were smiling at him. Sitting beside them was a small-eyed, shifty-looking man Harry recognized immediately, Wormtail, the one who betrayed his parents to Voldemort, leading to their deaths. Moody was startled. Harry looked up at Moody's severely scarred, lumpy face. It was clear that Moody felt he had brought Harry some discomfort, and was upset about it. Ah, well. Harry tried to force a smile. I just remembered, I haven't finished packing. He was trying to use the excuse of unfinished packing to escape the awkward situation. Sirius said, "What are you doing over there, Moody?" Moody turned to Sirius, and Harry quickly crossed the kitchen, and slipped out of the room, heading upstairs before anyone could call him back. He didn't understand why this photo had shaken him so much. He had seen pictures of his parents before, after all, and he had encountered Wormtail. But they were so close. No one would like to see this, he thought angrily. And those happy faces surrounding his parents. Benji Fenwick, who only a small part of his body was found, Gideon Pruitt, who died heroically, the Longbottoms, who were tortured into insanity. In the photo, they would always be waving happily, unaware of their fate. Yes, Moody might think it was interesting, but he, Harry, found it disturbing. Harry tiptoed upstairs, gradually recovering himself. He was slowly calming down, but when he reached the first floor, he heard someone crying in the sitting room. "Is someone there?" Harry asked. The crying didn't stop, but there was no answer. Harry took the stairs 2 at a time, crossed the landing, and opened the sitting room door. Someone was curled up in the dark corner, holding a wand, sobbing and trembling. A corpse lay on the dirty, old carpet in the moonlight. It was Ron. Harry felt the air sucked out of his lungs, he felt dizzy, his mind went cold. Ron was dead. No, this couldn't be. Wait, it really couldn't be. Ron was downstairs, Mrs. Weasley. Harry croaked. Ridiculous. Mrs. Weasley sobbed, pointing her trembling wand at Ron's body. Bang. Ron's body turned into Bill's, with a large gash on his back, his eyes wide open and empty. Mrs. Weasley sobbed even harder. Ridiculous, she said again. Bang. The body turned into Mr. Weasley, his glasses were askew, blood streaming down his face. No. Mrs. Weasley screamed, no. Ridiculous. 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 Bang. The bodies of the twins, bang. Percy, bang. Harry's body, Mrs. Weasley, get out of here. Harry shouted, looking at his own body lying on the floor. Let the others, what's going on? Lupin rushed into the room, followed by Sirius. Moody limped in as well. Lupin took one look at the floor where Mrs. Weasley saw Harry's body, and immediately understood. He pulled out his wand and said very clearly and firmly, ridiculous. Harry's body disappeared, replaced by a cloud of silver smoke. Lupin waved his wand again, and the silver smoke vanished instantly. Oh no. Mrs. Weasley choked for a moment, buried her face in her hands, and finally began to cry. "Molly," Lupin said softly, walking toward her. "Molly, don't." Suddenly, Mrs. Weasley collapsed on Lupin's shoulder, sobbing. "Molly, it was just a boggart," Lupin said comfortingly, gently patting her head. "Just a stupid boggart. I saw them die. They all died at the same time." Mrs. Weasley sobbed into Lupin's shoulder. "At the same time?" I saw it." Sirius stared at the spot where the boggart had been, imagining Harry's body lying there. Moody was watching Harry, who avoided his gaze. Suddenly a strange thought. Moody's magical. I had been following him ever since he left the kitchen. This is purely my personal opinion of a very good work. So I made this video for everyone. I appreciate you watching this video. If you like it, please support this series. Your engagement is my motivation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the little bell next to it, and give me a thumbs up too.